May I first ask you to turn off your cell phones, please? Thank you. My name is Molly Anderson, and as Executive Director of the Nantucket Atheneum, I wish to welcome you to the final event of this year's Geschke Lecture Series. Every year, the Atheneum provides more than 800 educational and cultural programs for our island. And we have limited government funding, so programs like the one you're to hear tonight wouldn't be possible if we didn't receive very, very generous donations and grants. So tonight's program, for example, is possible because of grants from the Geschke Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities and individual donors as well. And I'd like to thank all of you who are here because I know many of you are real supporters of the Atheneum throughout the year. And I'm very, very grateful, as are people on this island, and I think we ought to celebrate that. And now it's my pleasure to welcome a wonderful friend of the Atheneum, Ken Roman, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Can you hear me? We're all going to be very careful about swallowing this mic tonight. I'm a friend of the Atheneum's and a friend of the speaker, and I'm following somebody I admire in Molly, and I'm introducing somebody I admire as well. So I'm in kind of an admiration sandwich here. The Atheneum is the heart of Nantucket. It was the first building, as you may know, that was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1846. And if you haven't read it, go read David McCulloch's great statement about the role of free libraries in America. It's just inside the front door of the Atheneum, and it is an absolute inspiration. But Molly Anderson's Atheneum offers obviously a great collection of free books and media, but she's also successfully transforming the institution in the digital age. She's completed an interactive learning lab for information literacy classes, opportunities such as learning opportunities such as MOOCs, recertification programs for teachers and nurses, higher education courses for college-age students, college-level courses for Nantucket High School students. The Atheneum supports the Nantucket High School Robotics Club. It's helping Nantucket businesses and nonprofits. They're doing vocational learning for Nantucket teens, and they have a space for adults and teens to tinker with tools like the 3D printer and scanner. So the Atheneum is closing the digital divide that still exists in much of the country. It's a model program, and it deserves our support. Our speaker tonight is a journalistic model. In this partisan age, he reports and interprets the news with an even-handed, fair-minded approach that's all too rare, and I really admire. Peter Baker has seen a lot of action in Washington and around the world, and he also comes here. He has family in Tom Nevers. He spent 20 years at the Washington Post. He covered the White House presidencies of Bill Clinton during the Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment battle. He covered George W. Bush's second term. And in between stints at the White House, he was the Moscow bureau chief during the rise of Putin, the rollback of Russian democracy, and the Second Chechen War. He's covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He joined the New York Times in 2008 as White House correspondent. He's a regular panelist on Washington Week. His first book was The Breach: Inside the Impeachment and Trial of William Jefferson Clinton. And with his wife, Susan Glasser, who's here, he wrote Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. He's won several prizes for his coverage of the presidency and reporting on the White House. And his new book, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, is a really terrific book. It's a very fair-minded, even-handed book. A story, Gwen Ifill says, George W. Bush was no puppet and Dick Cheney was no puppet master. Tom Brokaw describes the relationship. He said it was a contentious relationship worthy of Shakespeare. The book will, and Peter's talk will reinforce whatever prejudices you may have about Dick Cheney. It will enlarge your view of Bush, but most importantly, it will give you some real insights into how these difficult decisions are made in the White House. Books will be available afterwards for purchase and signing by the author. And look for Peter's byline. He's a really terrific writer. And please welcome Peter Baker here tonight.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. That's very, very generous of you, and thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for the honor of finishing this year's Geschke lecture series. It's a little intimidating, I have to say, to come at the end of such a spectacular roster of speakers that you all have had this year. And that's a little bit of pressure to wrap up the year in a good way, but hopefully we can have some fun tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to especially thank Ken and Molly and Amy, where is she, and Martin McCarrow for helping to make this happen, and everyone involved with the Atheneum here in Nantucket. What a wonderful institution. I think you all ought to feel really good about having it here in the community. I also want to thank my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, Lynn and Steve Glasser, who are here tonight. They own a house in Tom Nevers, and not only welcomed me into the family 15 years ago, but just as importantly, introduced me to the magic of Nantucket. And we've been coming here ever since, even when Susan and I were living overseas in Moscow, when we were traveling around Afghanistan and Iraq. Pretty much every summer we managed to find our way back here for a little break, and it was a nice respite from the wars, as it were. It's a special place filled with special people, and most especially those of you who come out on a nice night like tonight and devote your time to listening to a guy like me. Most importantly, I want to thank my beautiful wife, Susan Glasser, who's here, love of my life, and the best partner and editor anybody could ever want. She was my boss at the Washington Post. We met during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. We like to say at least one good thing came out of that episode. She's now the founding editor of Politico magazine, which comes out online every day, and for my money, along with the New York Times, is the best that journalism has to offer. I encourage you to read it. And I want to thank also my son, our son Theo, who, given a choice, understandably opted to stay home tonight and watch Kicking It Star Wars rather than hear old dad popping off. He gets that for free anytime, but Theo gave me some really good advice when I was writing this book, and I'm going to try to think about it again tonight. He says, "Dad, make it compelling." And I think that's good advice. Well, yeah, it's a little intimidating to speak to you from this particular microphone. I have to say, this is a first for me. I feel like I need to be inspirational, but unfortunately I'm going to talk about politics. So that might be hard. I was asked to speak about the stories dominating the news, and I have to say it reminded me of a recent public appearance by former Vice President Dick Cheney, actually. He was on a panel discussion in Washington with our friend Mike Allen of Politico. And at one point, Mike read aloud from Vice President Cheney's most recent book. He wrote a book last year about his history of heart disease and his medical struggles over the years. And Mike read a part where Vice President Cheney had written that he knew his heart was failing and he was about to die. And Mike asked him, well, what do you have to say now? And Cheney said, wrong again. And I remember that because I was asked several months ago to speak about the big stories of the day here tonight. I thought it's going to be August. There won't be very much happening. Wrong again. It's actually a really dizzying time in the news right now. It's hard to even keep up. So much is happening. We've got the war in Ukraine. We've got the war in Gaza. We've got the war in Iraq and the war in Syria. We've got the Bo Bergdahl prisoner swap and the crisis over the Afghan elections. We've got the Veterans Department melting down and the CIA spying on the Senate. We've got the capture of the leading suspect from the Benghazi attacks and the evacuation of the Americans from Libya. We've got a border crisis in Texas and dysfunction on Capitol Hill. As a former aide to President Obama put it the other day, you name it, the world is aflame. According to David Letterman, actually, President Obama called Hillary Clinton recently and asked, could you start early? It reminds me of the last days, actually, of the Bush administration, which is chronicled in this new book, Days of Fire. Pretend I'm showing it here. Bush was on his way out of office just a few weeks before Barack Obama's inauguration. He was hosting the Kennedy Center Awards at the White House. One of the recipients was the actor Morgan Freeman. And Bush kind of went through his list of movie credits and remembered that Freeman had played a president once himself in this movie called Deep Impact. You may remember it. That's the one where the comet comes and destroys all life as we know it on the planet. And Bush kind of looked up from his notes and said, that's about the only thing that hadn't happened in the last 8 years. And when he sat down, Condoleezza Rice kind of leaned over to him and whispered, don't tempt fate, we've got a few weeks left. Well, that's got to be something that President Obama feels like a little bit today, right? This is one thing, whatever their differences on politics, whatever their differences on ideology, President Bush and President Obama may feel they have some things in common right now. What the cascade of crises we're seeing now reminds us is that the presidency is often miscast. We think of it as being the leader of the free world, but really actually you're the head of the bucket brigade, trying to put out the latest fire. You may have grand ambitions for remaking the world, but the world has a way of not cooperating. And you find yourself struggling just to keep up.
President Obama seems to be politically right now very much where President Bush was at this point in his tenure. Now the issues are somewhat different, and obviously the decisions that they've made are different, and I'm not comparing them in their most substantive form, but as a matter of politics, no matter where they are as leaders of this country, and where we are as a public in viewing them, there's a remarkable similarity, actually. In our most recent poll, here at Times poll, just about 40% approve of the job. During President Bush's administration, you heard a lot of people say, well, he was the worst president ever. And now a Quinnipiac poll shows that 33% consider President Obama to be the worst president since World War II, worse than any of the others, sliding just in front of President Bush, who's got 28% who named him for that honor. It makes you wonder what it takes and whether it's even possible these days to be a successful president. Now, no doubt, past presidents have had great challenges, enormous challenges, bigger challenges than what we're seeing now. I mean, obviously, you think of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, you think of FDR in the Great Depression and World War II. But today's presidents face some challenges that their great predecessors never encountered, ones that they have yet to really master. It's a different world. We like to make comparisons, but the truth is Abraham Lincoln never had to deal with Twitter. Imagine trying to beat the Nazis in the era of Facebook. When Harry Truman dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, he didn't learn for 16 hours later that it had actually happened. Now when President Obama gives a speech, people are reviewing it 3 or 4 minutes in on Twitter and Facebook and setting opinions and forming consensus before the man's even finished speaking. Things have sped up so fast. They have accelerated in such a way that it's almost, that it's very difficult for our political leaders to kind of get hold of their own narrative and explain to the public what it is they're trying to do and persuade a majority to stand with them. Then there's the polarization that we're seeing today. It's hardly new, right? This is, our country is built on fundamental and often raucous debate of ideas. But today it has been exacerbated by a variety of forces that are pulling us further and further apart. Our congressional districts have been redrawn, so they're so homogenous that many members of the House worry more about primaries than they do about the general election. They're more likely to lose members of their own party for being insufficiently liberal if the Democrats are insufficiently conservative if they're Republicans. There's no incentive to move to the middle. There's no incentive for compromise in that. And it's not just our politicians. Increasingly, it's us. more and more we are living in communities with people who agree with us. We don't meet as many people on the other side of the fence as we once did. In 2012, 98, this is really interesting because statisticians charted this, right? 98% of the 50 counties with the densest populations, right? The most urban counties in America, 98% of them voted for President Obama. And 98% of the 50 counties that are the least dense, that is the most rural, the most sparsely populated, 98% of those voted for Governor Romney. They've actually figured out the median on this. If you live in a community with a population density of 800 people or more per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat than you are a Republican. If you live in a place with 800 or fewer than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. Now, interestingly, Nantucket has a population density of about 200 people per square mile in the off-season, and about 1,000 people per square mile during the summer. So I don't know, does that mean that Nantucket is Republican in winter and Democratic in summer? I'm not really sure. It's an interesting question. Either way, we live in different physical worlds, and we live in different informational worlds, and this is pulling us apart. If you're a conservative, you're more likely to watch Fox and think Benghazi is the biggest issue in the world. If you're liberal, you're more likely to watch MSNBC and think Governor Christie's bridge closing is the biggest issue in the world. And all of this is very frustrating and hard for presidents who are charged, at least by our common tradition, of bringing people together. You know, all three of the presidents that I've covered, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, all three of them promised to try to bridge this divide that we're seeing. And I actually believe all three of them genuinely meant it. I remember President Clinton talked about repairing the breach, which is a phrase he pulled from Isaiah. And President Bush, of course, said he's going to be a uniter, not a divider. And we all, of course, remember President Obama telling us it's not a red America and a blue America, but a United States of America. But you know, all three of them come to be stymied in that ambition. And truth be told, each of them has contributed in his own way as well to the divide that we're seeing today. Much as we may decry it, and we may wish it were otherwise, politics is about us and them, about rallying parts of the country against other parts. If you were to spend a day reading my email inbox, you'd see that both parties are pretty deeply engaged in this sort of thinking. Now, it's against this backdrop that we see today's crises, and they're so challenging because of how disparate they are and how much they seem to all be reaching a crescendo at the same time. Clearly, World War II or Vietnam or the Cold War were bigger issues for us, but they had a certain structure, you know, free world versus tyranny, or north versus south, east versus west. Here we have all these different issues in different places happening at the same time, and each of them is complicating the other. So imagine you're President Obama, right? At the same time, he's trying to rally the world to isolate Russia for its intervention in Ukraine. He's trying to work with Russia to push Iran to give up its nuclear program. At the same time, he's trying to get Iran to give up its nuclear program. He's on the same side as Iran in fighting the new resurgence in Iraq. At the same time, he's fighting ISIS in Iraq. He's fighting ISIS's enemy in Syria. At the same time, he's penalized Egypt for its military takeover of the government. He's trying to get Egypt to work with him to get Hamas to stop shooting rockets into Israel. And at the same time, he's trying to support Israel and Gaza. He's trying to convince Europe that he's really sympathetic to the Palestinian civilian casualties. And at the same time, he's working with Germany to organize sanctions against Russia. He's trying to make amends for the fact that they've been spying on Germany. So all this, you know, adds up to a pretty toxic menu of problems without a lot of easy solutions. And the American public, honestly, hasn't been very impressed lately with the way the president has handled all of this. Now, some of this is natural. Typically, when the world seems to be unraveling, presidents' approval ratings tend to fall. We want them to be masters of the universe. We want them to be in charge of events and command of the world, and sometimes they're not. It also reflects, I think, a sense that President Obama hasn't asserted leadership as much as the public wants him to. He strikes people as often as too passive or reactive. His admirers say it's actually thoughtfulness and a relief after the cowboy predecessor he had. But in our latest poll, 58% disapproved of his handling of foreign affairs, which is a 10-point jump from what it had been a month earlier and the highest he's seen in his presidency. But here's the challenge for President Obama. They're not happy with the way he's handling international crises, but they don't want to get more involved in those crises at all. The public doesn't want to go back to Iraq. He doesn't want us to go to Ukraine or Syria. He doesn't want us to stay in Afghanistan. And President Obama's approach actually reflects that broader public sentiment, even as the public grades him poorly. So many of these issues that President Obama is grappling with, of course, have their roots in the last administration, right? Iraq, NSA surveillance, Russia, Iraq, terrorism, immigration, the interrogation report we're talking about in the Senate. Sound familiar? That's why it's important to understand what happened then and why in that administration, and not just the mythology. That's what I spent 6 years doing with this book. And what I learned about that administration, I think, applies to this one and to the Clinton administration, and probably others as well, which is that we only scratch the surface of what we really understand about a presidency in the moment. Just point a number out of the air, I often think that we get reporters and the public, we get maybe 20% of what's happening inside a White House at any given time. It's in their interest not to tell us, and it's a very closed environment. But in researching the book, I learned again and again how much there is going on that we didn't know and how worthwhile it is to go back and try to discover it. So take the Bush and Cheney administration. If we were to follow a common understanding, we would think that these are two men who, one was an easily manipulated front man, the other was sort of the secret puppet master behind the scenes pulling strings. Let's face it, it made for a lot of great late night jokes. And, you know, Vice President Cheney actually, for one, kind of embraced it at one point. You know, his staff actually brought him a Darth Vader mask and gave it to him as a gift, and he put it on. And there's an official White House photograph of him wearing a Darth Vader mask somewhere in the archives. I've yet to find it. But Cheney actually wanted to put it in his own memoir until Lynn Cheney understandably talked him out of it. But what I discovered in the research for the book was that this common caricature really missed the fundamental and actually much more interesting nature of their relationship, how much more it evolved over time from this extraordinary collaboration that we generally think of to almost a complete break by the time that they left office. And there's no question that Dick Cheney was the most powerful vice president in history. I think that, you know, that's not saying too much. It's kind of a sorry history, the vice presidency. John Adams said it was the most insignificant office that ever invented by man. Thomas Marshall, Woodrow Wilson's vice president, told me about two brothers. One went off to sea, and one became vice president, neither was ever heard from again. Lyndon Johnson said, I detested every minute of being vice president. Gerald Ford called the worst 8 months of his life. It wasn't actually until Walter Mondale that they even let the vice president in the White House. They didn't have an office in the West Wing until Mondale had one under Jimmy Carter. Now, Vice President Cheney actually knew all this because he told me in an interview, he said the vice president was a crappy job. That was his phrase, a crappy job. And he should know because he kind of needed a crappy job for a couple of them. He was Ford's chief of staff, of course, and he basically shuffled Nelson Rockefeller off a ticket in 1976. And he was Bush 41's defense secretary, and he basically boxed out Dan Quayle from national security. So the vice president has no role in those kinds of decisions. But he had what he called a different understanding with President Bush. And over time, he assembled a power base through a manager in Washington that worked like no other predecessor had. And he built a relationship of trust with President Bush, who actually welcomed a powerful vice president. President Bush gave him access to every meeting and decision. You know, Harry Truman, when he was vice president, only met with FDR twice. Vice President Cheney was asked in 2002 how many times he met with President Bush. And he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his full schedule. He said, let me see, 3, 4, 5. 7 times, he said, and then paused for effect. Today. And, you know, that's okay, because President Bush actually wanted that. That's what he wanted in a vice president. He trusted Dick Cheney to be his advisor, his counselor, his number 2 guy. So much so that in March 2003, on the eve of the Iraq War, when they were making this fateful decision about whether to go in or not, and George Tenet from the CIA comes over and says, we've got this intelligence, we think we know where Saddam Hussein is, we could have an early strike. And Bush talks about it with his advisors, and then he kicks them all out of the room. The only one he keeps in the room is Dick Cheney. The one he wants to finally make this fateful decision with alone is Dick Cheney. But as you explore the evolution, actually, you find that this doesn't last. Ultimately, President Bush and Vice President Cheney begin moving apart. Late in the first term, even more so in the second term, frustrated by the failure to find weapons he were told were in Iraq and by the rising crescendo of violence, President Bush begins trying to correct course, as he saw it, by repairing the breach with the Allies, by working more on diplomacy, by elevating Condi Rice as Secretary of State, who becomes sort of the counter force in his administration to Vice President Cheney. Now, that's not to say Vice President Cheney was entirely on the margins on the second term, but he was on defense more than offense, trying to fend off changes that he didn't think were wise. President Bush closed the CIA black sites. There was, there was no waterboarding in the second term. He went to Congress to get approval for the surveillance program that proved so controversial. He was beginning to move away from the most controversial programs of the first term that would define his presidency so much. In a way, it was too late because they still define his presidency today. But Vice President Cheney found it disturbing, and the two were increasingly at odds. In fact, by the time he left office, President Bush and Vice President Cheney were on the opposite sides of almost every major issue that was coming before them, like North Korea, gun rights, same-sex marriage, tax cuts, Guantanamo, interrogation practices, surveillance policy, Iran, the auto bailout, climate change, the Lebanon war, Harriet Miers, Donald Rumsfeld, Middle East peace talks, Syria, Russia, federal spending, you name it. They were on the opposite sides. And the really telling moment comes in the spring of 2007. Israeli intelligence comes to Washington. They provide this report that Syria has a secret nuclear plant in the desert being built with the help of North Korea. And they the Israeli leaders asked President Bush to bomb it because of the threat. This time, much like the Iraq decision, President Bush gathers all his advisors around and he asks them what they think. And then he says, they ask the Vice President what he thinks. Vice President Cheney makes an argument that they should bomb it because he thinks that have they drawn a red line about proliferation. If they don't live up to that red line, they'll have lost all their credibility, and that's the move the president should make. President Bush then asks, does anyone here agree with the Vice President? And no hands go up. What a contrast to that decision right before Iraq, right? Not only does he not have this discussion alone with Cheney in a room, just the two of them, he forces him to have it in the open in front of all the advisors and to confront the marginalization of his second term. All this comes ahead in the frantic final days of the administration. As if they didn't have enough on their plates with the economic collapse and the financial crisis. President Bush and Vice President Cheney spent their last weeks in office fighting about whether to give pardon to Scooter Libby. Now, Libby, of course, had been Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, his right-hand man, Cheney's Cheney, they called it, and he got convicted in the CIA leak case. Not the leak itself, but for lying under oath, according to prosecutors and according to the jury, about how he learned about Valerie Plame's affiliation with the CIA. Cheney thought it was a travesty, he thought it was politically bogus, and that this should be overturned, that it should not be allowed to stand. President Bush was skeptical. He sent out a couple of lawyers to go look at the case again. They came back and said, well, we think the jury had every reason to find what it found. President Bush said, fine, no pardon. But when he told Vice President Cheney about it, Cheney snapped at him. You're leaving a good man wounded on the field of battle, which is probably the harshest thing he'd ever actually said to the president in his face. Something that was designed to go for Bush's own sense of his own loyalty toward his people. In effect, President Cheney was asking for one last validation of this partnership that they had, and Bush refused to give it to him. Now, President Bush was really bothered by this. He's normally the decider, right? He doesn't second-guess decisions, but this is one he couldn't let go. He went up to Camp David for his final weekend in office. It was supposed to be kind of a celebration with family and friends, marking the end of their tumultuous time in office together, and he's brooding about this fight he had had with Cheney, who was not there. Condi Rice took him aside and said, look, he shouldn't make us appall over his final days in office. Laura Bush told him, just make up your mind and ruin this for everyone. And he finally did. He would stick with his decision on no pardon. But 2 days later, Inauguration Day 2009, Bush hosted his successor, Barack Obama, at the White House for the traditional coffee between incoming and outgoing presidents. And then they get in the car, the armored car that takes them to the Capitol for the inauguration. Just the two of them in the Secret Service driving. And President Bush leaves him with one piece of advice. He says, whatever you do, set a pardon policy early and stick to it. In other words, don't let it happen to you what happened to me. So there he was after all these years of war and terrorism and natural disaster, all the different things that had all these days of fire, right, if you will. And the thing that was on his mind as he was leaving power at the very end of his presidency was this fight he had had with his vice president. So what will we learn about this presidency when it's over? Will we discover that Joe Biden was actually just secretly running things? Maybe? Probably not. Although interestingly, the arc of their relationship does have some similarities to that of Bush and Cheney. In both cases, you had a top-of-the-ticket candidate who didn't really have much Washington experience, didn't really have much international experience, and who relied on a much more seasoned number two to advise them and give them guidance. And you had, just like Cheney, Vice President Biden is in meetings with President Obama 6-7 times a day. And in that case, too, you also see how it's changed in the second term. As President Obama has grown more comfortable, more confident in his own judgments, you see less and less of Vice President Biden. But one thing, as he makes his way through his 6th year in office, one thing we do know, the 6th year of a presidency is never easy. Richard Nixon resigned in the 6th year of his presidency, 40 years ago this week, in fact. Iran-Contra broke in the 6th year of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Bill Clinton was impeached in the 6th year of his presidency. George W. Bush found Iraq going south in the 6th year of his presidency, and we know what President Obama's 6th year has been like so far. And it's only halfway through the year. But if you really think about what the book on President Obama's tenure might look like, I confess I'm kind of thinking of a title more like War Days, Warfire. It just feels like we're in a period where presidents are struggling with so many different things in so many different parts of the world that it's hard to see how they will adapt. Now, that's not to say a president can't rebound. I mean, that happens. President Obama has more than 2 years left. President Reagan redefined relations with the Soviet Union in his last couple of years in office. President Clinton waged and won the Kosovo War in his final 2 years in office. President Bush arguably turned Iraq around with a troop surge and a strategy change. But for President Obama, the frustrating thing I think right now is it's hard to see where those opportunities lie. Domestically, his chances for major legislation are pretty minimal. I think he even says so publicly. Internationally, there don't seem to be a lot of obvious avenues for breakthroughs either. He holds out hope for a landmark deal with Iran that if it did happen, actually would be a pretty major item for his legacy. But President Obama mostly talks about his first-term achievements, like passing the health care program, and if he can make that work and survive the latest court challenges, that will be a big item for his legacy. But these are slogging days for President Obama, and truth be told, he doesn't look like he's having all that much fun. It's his birthday today, and he had a press conference on Friday, and he was kind of annoyed that the press didn't actually wish him a happy birthday. But, it's funny, because President Bush left office, he moved down to Dallas, and he had a dinner party, and he told people that when he was at President Obama's inauguration, he saw President Obama's hand go up over the Bible, and he says, I thought to myself, free at last. And you got to wonder whether on January 20, 2017, President Obama might feel the same way. Thank you very much. We can take some questions, I think. Yes, sir, right here.
I actually have two. Comment both related to things that were in your presentation. One about the relationship between George W. and his father, which Nicholas said reported that was not the greatest, that Senior Bush really preferred Jeff to George, who was wild and very. The second question is, in terms of the Israeli conflict, as I read it, Europe ends up being anti-Israeli on that, and the United States is regarded as being pro-Israeli.
Right, that's two good questions. I'll repeat the first one, I'll come to the second one. The first one's about the relationship between President Bush and his father, President Bush 41. We saw just last week that President Bush 43 has said he's now written a biography of his father, which is going to come out in November. It'll be interesting to see what it says. I suspect it'll be, kind of like a Hallmark card. It'll be a tribute to his father. And we'll learn what we want to know, which is what it was like, right? Think about this. We had John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but by the time Quincy Adams became president, John Adams was too old to even come to Washington. So this is really a unique circumstance in American history, and I agree with you, like the real black box to penetrate is to understand the relationship between these two men. And I don't pretend to, answer that question here tonight, but I do think that obviously you're right that the family had thought Jeb was a more likely one to become a president, to become a political figure. George W. resented that. In fact, on the night of the election in 1994, when Jeb was running for governor of Florida and George W. was running for governor of Texas, and Jeb lost and George W. won, George W. overheard his parents on the phone with Jeb, commiserating with them, and he says, why are you unhappy for him? Why aren't you happy for me? So there's always been this, stress, as would be, you imagine the stress that we all have in our families, the various issues that come up between fathers and sons, and then, overlap on that, the great geopolitical questions of the day. It's hard to imagine. He said famously to Bob Woodward, I consult a higher father, which was meant to say, I'm not my daddy's boy. And yet so much of his presidency did seem at times in reaction to it, right? When he picks John Roberts, he very explicitly says to one of his advisors that this isn't going to be a suitor. When he goes for tax cuts, he very explicitly says, I'm not going to do a read my lips reversal on this. When he obviously goes to war in Iraq, he's going to take out Saddam Hussein where his father did. So I don't want to get too far into the psychobabble area on this, but clearly a father-son relationship matters powerfully in that story. And my friend Mark Upton, who's director of the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library, is writing a book about this, so hopefully his book will help us answer that. Your second question was about the Middle East, about how Europe is seen as pro-Palestinian and the United States is seen as pro-Israel, and there's a lot of truth to that. I think that, the tension between us and Europe often is that the Europeans think we're not doing enough to rein Israel in, and we think they're not sympathetic enough to Israel's predicaments in this situation, and that's happening this time around as well, I'm afraid. It's just the nature of that relationship, and we've seen a lot of stories about anti-Semitism in Europe lately that I think are pretty disturbing. But President Obama, I think, is also legitimately, authentically upset about civilian casualties. They put out a pretty harshly worded statement about some of the more recent, attacks on UN facilities in Gaza. And it's a terrible situation for any president. Every president seems to find himself, and maybe soon herself, in the same predicament, trying to find a way to both defend Israel's right to defend itself without countenancing what seems to many Americans and many Europeans is a disproportionate response. So. Yes, sir.
So in June, Politico released the lengthy survey of White House correspondents, and there seems to be a lot of talk about how the White House's aggressive pursuit of leaks, as well as the use of anonymous sourcing by White House staffers, is a real issue. Having covered 3 White Houses, how has the culture of actually covering the White House changed, and what would you like to see change in this White House?
That's a great question. The question is about, it references a poll done by Politico magazine. I don't know anybody in this room who would know more about that, but maybe somebody in the middle row right there who actually sponsored the poll. And the poll was about basically White House relationships with its reporters. And we're having this conversation lately because in fact President Obama did promise that this would be the most open, most transparent administration ever. And it's a lot like previous administrations. They like background briefings. Background means we don't get to identify the person who's talking. They like secrecy when it benefits them, and then get mad when reporters use sources who are not authorized to provide them information. They have 8 prosecutions going on right now in leak cases, more than every other administration combined, in which my colleague Jim Rising still faces the threat of jail for not revealing sources. So there's a fair bit of tension right now between them. I do think that the Obama White House has been, my former boss, Jill Abramson, says the most secretive White House she had dealt with. And I think she's got a point. These guys do more on background, more without names attached, more through anonymity than the 2 previous ones that I had dealt with. Now, I think it's a trend with each administration, and that probably would have been true if this has been a Republican administration. It'll probably be true with the next administration. It's just sort of an inexorable trend in Washington, in which the default setting increasingly is hiding behind the cloak of secrecy rather than transparency. It's a broader issue than just this particular White House, but this White House has not solved it, and in fact has perpetuated it. Right here, sir.
Given your past experience in Russia, could you comment on how Mr. Putin reacted as well?
Right, that's a great question. The question is about Putin and Obama and their relationship. We were just having this conversation with a good friend here, Dan Yerg, and Angela Stent has written a book after you buy mine, please buy hers, about it's called the Limits of Partnership, about the history of Russia and the United States, particularly in the post-Cold War period. Very insightful. These two guys don't like each other. I mean, that shouldn't matter, but it does, right? They're personally at odds with each other. Their chemistry doesn't work with each other. Putin doesn't respect Obama, doesn't think much of him. Made that clear from the very first meeting, harangued him for an hour before Obama even got to say hello. Obama doesn't understand people like that. Doesn't particularly like him, doesn't particularly connect with them. He liked Medvedev, who was for 4 years allowed to sit in the president's chair by Putin, but was not really in charge. Connected with him, Obama did. But Obama made the mistake of thinking that they could build Medvedev up and hope that he would in fact represent the future, but in fact he was just a placeholder for a while. So Obama and Putin are very personally, they don't connect well. They say these things about each other that are really interesting. What was the phrase was, Obama said he just kind of slouches in his chair, and he, like the bad boy in the classroom. And what did Putin say the other day, that he should go back to being a lawyer or something like that? So it's gotten personal, and that doesn't help at a time when, in fact, the larger and more significant interests are at stake, are also in conflict.
I have basically two questions or thoughts. It seems the way our system works is you get elected, you're the most popular person, and the person who's leaving is probably the most qualified.
Yeah.
And then restart again.
Right.
So often I wonder, is the United States under our present setup governed by the situation? And then I also have a reaction to a man like Mr. Putin, who's in office more than 10 years. I think there would be a worldwide field that you cannot be in office. But then on a particular question, I'm wondering about how you view the George Bush insurgency in Iraq, so that by the time, as I understand it, we turned the presidency over to Obama, Iraq was kind of quiescent and leaning towards us. And then Mr. Obama pulling out the American troops from Iraq and leaving it.
Right, that's good. Okay, well, two good questions. The first one is probably more of a commentary. The question is the United States governable these days? And I think that is the big question. And I don't have the answer myself, but I'm an optimist at heart. I tend to believe that yes, it's going to be governable, but we haven't figured out how yet. And we've been through periods like this. There was a period, I think in the 60s and 70s, we were wondering, will we ever be able to feel good about ourselves and our leadership again? And I think several presidents came along and we felt better about things for a while. And so it may be that we're in a period of malaise, to use Jimmy Carter's unfortunate phrase, that will eventually correct itself. I think the presidents have to figure out how to use the new media, figure out how the new world works in a way that connects them to the American people, and to their policies and decisions in a way they haven't so far. And it's not surprising. There's a lot of the new changes in technology and communication have disrupted a lot of fields, including my own. Right? Journalism is not quite what it once was, and it's trying to figure out its new way forward. I think the same is true of politics. So I think eventually, yes, they're going to figure this out, but it's an enormous job. The difference between what Harry Truman had to deal with as a president and what George Bush or Barack Obama have to deal with as a president is just, night and day. They're completely different set of challenges and enormous things. Everything that goes wrong in this government we blame on our president, even though it's a government of 2 million employees plus multiple, federal contracts and so forth. So it's a very tough situation. I confess that my colleagues and I don't always make it easier for them, but I do think that somebody's going to figure out how to play this game at some point. On the other questions about Bush and Iraq, did Bush in fact leave Iraq in a better shape for Obama than he chose not to leave troops behind? There's something to that. By the time they left office, by the time Bush left office, Iraq was in a better place. Violence was substantially down, 90% down. It seemed a moment of optimism. He negotiated an agreement with Iraq on the way out of office that said, okay, here's a 3-year withdrawal plan. And in effect, what President Obama did, was to take that plan and more or less abide by it. Now, there was this pressure in 2011, okay, well, we're going to leave at the end of 2011. That was the Bush plan. Obama is following through. But should we leave more troops behind, some troops behind as a residual force? And what President Obama would tell you is the Iraqis didn't really want them. They wouldn't give us this liability agreement we wanted. And what the Iraqis would tell you is, they weren't really offering us that many forces anyway, and we wanted to have we want to stand on our own in effect. So each side has a story to tell. The truth is, I think both sides are ready for it to be done. Both sides thought, let's just move on. Neither side was unhappy that there weren't any residual forces left behind. And President Obama then went out on the campaign trail the next year and bragged about ending the war in Iraq, at least the American war in Iraq. So, it might have seemed like a rational decision at the time. Obviously, what they really failed to see was how Syria was going to explode and spill over the border in such a powerful way that Iraq would be incapable of defending its own cities. And so I think the leading truth behind this important issue will be debated. Both sides have different points of view. And an even bigger issue, frankly, is what could we, should we, might we have done in terms of Syria to have kept it from becoming the giant disaster that it's become. And that's what you would hear people inside the Obama administration say if they were being honest. So, right back there, sure.
Dick Cheney never served in the military. He had 5 student deferments. George Bush was in the Texas or Louisiana.
Air National Guard, yes, sir.
Never showed up. But Cheney convinced Bush to send troops to the Middle East, and I wonder what you think about how we should judge Cheney, who's responsible for the deaths and wounded of all the American military who fought in the Middle East with nothing to gain for the United States.
Okay, great. The question is basically that Cheney, who had 5 student deferments, never served in the military, and Bush, who served in the Texas Air National Guard, and of course sent American men and women to war in the Middle East. And that's, look, that's the defining decision that they made, that they're going to be judged by history. Absolutely, there's no question about that. Most Americans today, according to polls, think that was a mistake. Neither President Bush nor Vice President Cheney today would agree with that, although President Bush has said that they did things, they didn't always do everything the way they should have done it, but neither one of them has backed off that fundamental decision. And that's one they're going to live with and defend and argue through the course of history. It's not going to be for me to tell you tonight it was a right decision or a wrong decision. I think we all, by the way, have our own opinions about that. You don't need me to tell you what to think about that, but it's no question that's the big fundamental legacy of the administration. They're going to argue about that for a lot of years to come. Yes, sir.
I only have one question. Putin has now been in charge for a long time. You know his presidency. How long will he stay in power? And if he's gone, what kind of other people are behind him? Because a lot of people in the Netherlands think that what's coming after him is even more scary than himself.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, how long will Putin stay in power, and would the people who might come after him be even worse? And it's interesting that you said it, because I think that you said the Netherlands, I take it that's where you're from.
Yeah.
I think that does drive a lot of European thinking about Putin. One reason why sometimes Europeans are more reluctant than the Americans are to be confrontational is that they see Putin as being terrible, but not as terrible as we might yet get, right? And that's an interesting question. How long will Putin stay in power? I think, the system is rigged at this point. He'll stay in power as long as he wants to stay in power. And there's a disincentive for him to leave, right? Democracies and healthy societies create an incentive for people to step down from power and to live the rest of their lives in security and the knowledge that they're not going to be, persecuted or what have you. And in Russia, there is no such history, right? Nobody stepped down, frankly, willingly until Boris Yeltsin. You could argue about Gorbachev. I don't think he was really willing, but he's, so they didn't really have the history of czars and general secretaries. You either died in office, you were taken out. There was no history where you step down, you go gracefully into some sort of elder statesman retirement kind of mode. And Putin understands that when you leave office in Russia, you lose the mechanism of power, and therefore all the things you built up, whatever money you stashed away, whatever houses and dachas and so forth, all of that is subject to the new czar, the new president, and that you put yourself at risk. So for Putin, there's a disincentive to leave power willingly, because he would then, in his mind at least, be exposed to the danger of whoever came after him, even if it was somebody he picked by hand. He, of course, was handpicked by Boris Yeltsin, right? Yeltsin wasn't bothered in retirement, but he was also kept under basically an internal exile kind of lifestyle at that point. And that, in fact, was the deal. Like, we won't prosecute you you leave power, but that's the end. You're done. So Putin doesn't have an incentive to leave power, and he shows very little signs of being interested in grooming a successor. He's marginalized Medvedev. The people who might come after him, who might logically come after him, have not sort of shown have not shown themselves yet in a way that we could judge who will come next, because he understands that to have somebody rise like that is to create a rival and a threat, and he won't do it. So I think we've got a lot of years of Putin still to come. Yes, sir.
You talked earlier about Obama and Putin not getting along. Obama clearly doesn't get along with Netanyahu. He doesn't get along with John Boehner. He doesn't get along with Mitch McConnell. Does he have is it his personality? Is it a bad PR?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if President Obama doesn't get along with President Putin, he doesn't get along with Prime Minister Netanyahu or Speaker Boehner or Mitch McConnell, does he get along with anybody in effect? Does he have a personality issue? Well, look, I mean, those are guys who might be hard for any president or any Democratic president anyway to get along with. Some of these things might be true regardless of who was president. But there's no question he's not a politician the way Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were, right? Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, they like people, they like interacting with, they're extroverts, they enjoy a crowd. Nobody more than Clinton, especially, they pull Clinton away from a crowd, right? Bush isn't quite that bad, but he enjoyed getting out there and meeting people. He enjoyed making friends with foreign leaders that he made friends with, maybe to a fault, right? Maybe he should have seen Putin's soul something a little different earlier on. But both of them were inherently political people, and Barack Obama is not inherently a natural politician. And he's very talented in a lot of ways. He's obviously, super impressive in many ways, but he's an introvert. He doesn't take charge. If the definition of an extrovert is somebody who takes charge or gets energy from the crowd or the people, he is the opposite of that. In fact, his aides told me, after he would address a large crowd in the East Room, they would try if they could, but give him 5 minutes in his schedule so that he would have time to kind of recharge his batteries afterwards, because it expended energy rather than taking it in. So, he's a reserved person. He's not hell met, well fell, whatever that phrase is. And it's a challenge for him. That's definitely a problem. Now, he would tell you that he has a lot of friends among the international set. That he and Angela Merkel are pretty close. That's been tested lately. He speaks highly of David Cameron, and he thinks that he has a good relationship with him, and there are a few others. But he also kind of, I think, disdains the idea that this is about personal relationships. In his view, that's sort of, intellectually shallow, and really our relations with the countries and relations with the parties are about interests, and not whether I go golfing with John Boehner. He hates that idea that if he simply took John Boehner golfing, suddenly the world would be better. He doesn't think much of that. He despises that. And he won't play that game, right? Other presidents may also agree with that, but they at least kind of play the game a little bit. He doesn't believe in playing the game. So, yeah. I'm told 2 more questions. Sir, right here.
How successful do you think Putin will be with China and aligning a unified front against the United States and our allies?
How Putin, you mean? Yeah. So the question is, how successful will Putin be in aligning with China against the United States' interests? And there's no question that as sanctions have been piled on Russia, that they have tried to find ways to turn China increasingly for economic cooperation, financing, and so forth. China, of course, is gobbling up energy, and Russia has some to sell. And so we have a national alignment, even regardless of what our current relationship with them is like. But I think the Chinese are bothered by what's happening in Ukraine, too. I mean, this is not what they favor. Historically, they have resisted the idea that countries ought to be able to, to sort of intrude like that. And I think that they are trying to find a balance between, the economic interests and the political interests they have with Russia, and not validating what they see as a pretty dangerous policy course that Putin has been on. So I think each of them has their interests, and we're going to have to manage those. But it's I'm not that convinced there'll be some great Russia-China alignment against it, because we talked about for a lot of years without really materializing in a meaningful way. I think we've got one more. Yeah. Yes, right back there. Sorry, lady in the back. Her, and then we'll come to you, sir. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that other than having 15-20% of the ability or control 50-20% of what's going on, what characteristics do you think the president might hold that will give them perhaps a little bit more control or greater percentage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if the president's only controls, say, 15-20% of events around them, what kind of characteristics do we want to see, or could we see the president who might be able to get it up to 30%? That's a great question. I don't know that I have a fabulous answer. I mean, there's certainly, I mean, part of it is commanding personality, obviously. Part of it is, how much you try to dictate events. Clearly, LBJ had a powerful and outsized, in fact, personality that, made him driven to control events. And yet even he, found himself trapped in this paradigm of Vietnam where he actually thought there's no way to win, and yet he kept sending more troops anyway, right? So I think it's hard to, I don't know the answer to the question, unfortunately. I wish I did, right, to say, that we had this kind of person, we'd have a better president. I think good presidents come in different forms, and it depends on the times that they're governing in. And would Abraham Lincoln have been remembered as a great president in a time that didn't have a civil war? That's a really great question. Would FDR have been remembered great if he weren't for the great challenges? Bill Clinton used to actually be annoyed that he didn't have a war or a crisis on his watch. Not that he wanted there to be a war or a crisis, but that he understood that we measure our presidents by how they deal with great events, and that he never had his opportunity for that, right? Now today, nobody wishes for these things, but he really resented that because he felt that Teddy Roosevelt was the only one who was ever able to become great in our minds without that kind of a background. Unfortunately, what we've had is the last two presidents with, in fact, great challenges, and they're still trying to figure out ways to master them. So I did promise one guy here that I would let him. Yes, sir, right here.
What's the probability in your view that Hillary will be our next president? And if she's not, what scenario could you foresee where she's not the next president?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, I've been waiting for this all night. Will Hillary be president? The other question nobody asked, by the way, I'm going to say is, where would Bush be measured in history? And my answer I came up with a while ago was definitely top 50. So Hillary Clinton. But you know what? Let's just start with the idea that obviously she's running right now, right? She's running for president right now. You don't do what she's doing without, that in mind. And I think it's got to be hard if somebody whispers in your hearing warning, not only you can be president, but you're the prohibited favorite to be president, to say, I'm not going to run. Now, having said that, tomorrow she announced she's not running, I look like a fool. So I'm not making any predictions, but I think she's got a very good chance. I don't think there's any non-incumbent president or vice president who is as well positioned for her party's nomination as she is right now in modern times. Even Ike, the national hero, had a tougher fight out of Bob Taft than Hillary looks like she's going to get from Martin O'Malley or Andrew Cuomo or even Elizabeth Warren. But we don't give it to you for free. It's 2.5 years out. Something is going to happen. She's going to take a hit. There's going to be a fall. There'll be a crisis. There'll be a stumble. Some big scandal will come up, whatever. Something will happen, and she will be tested. And it will be in that moment we discover whether or not she's ever going to be able to translate the huge advantage that she has now into winning the presidency. She had huge advantage in 2008, right? I mean, she should have, by neutral political science standards, have won that race, and she didn't. We don't see a Barack Obama on the horizon right now who would be the obvious person to take it away. So I wouldn't want to make a prediction, but if you had to put money on it, there are riskier bets. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, on behalf of all of us and on behalf of the Atheneum. I think we can all agree this country could use more Peter Bakers in journalism. Thank you.